One of the themes of your book that crosses into the themes that we've been exploring is the post-World War II consensus.
Winston, I would say money is at the heart of it all. The nature of money has changed. And in 1945, they agreed a new monetary order. And you've seen the relentless appreciation in price of everything since 1971. Salaries have gone up, house prices have gone up, car prices have gone up. It is all caused by our system of money. Coming off the gold standard enabled the First World War. When he became president, Americans all had to hand in their gold and they would be given US dollars in exchange. 9 months later, he just debased the US dollar by 40%. When a government is able to create money at no cost to itself, that is why you see this endless expansion of government. More and more people become dependent on the government in some way for their income, and so more and more people vote for it.
The rise of cryptocurrencies and the natural response to wanting to have that solid currency.
Hungary, all its confiscated bitcoins confiscated from drug dealing, it sold them all in 2018. If it had kept those bitcoins, that would be enough now to...
Wow.
Yeah.
How to fix the system of money then?
Well,
Dominic Frisby, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time. Congratulations on your book, The Secret History of Gold, Myth, Money, Politics and Power, which I'm excited to get into. I think that a lot of our audience will already know you for quite a different thing, which is your music and your viral videos. And only last year, Elon Musk retweeted your video, We're All Far Right Now.
We're all far right now, we're all far right now. Peterson, Rogan, Shapiro, E-I-E-I-E-I-O. We worship Mussolini, his portrait's in the loft. Must say Twitter, hi or Hitler, we're all far right now.
Which had 50 million views at least.
on Twitter, yeah.
On Twitter. And then I first came across you with your famous song, 17 Million F-Offs, which was a celebration, I think, of Brexit back in 2016.
Yeah. I think it was actually 2018.
2018
came in when they were trying to debunk it, and that's when I. You remember they were trying to undermine it and stop it happening, and that's when I wrote that.
Okay, you'd had enough. But today we're going to talk about something quite different. But maybe our audience aren't aware that you are quite a prolific writer on economics. Of course, you've now written this history of gold, and you have your very successful Substack, The Flying Frisbee, where you write about what's going on in the world of Bitcoin and various economic policies going on, not just in Britain, but around the world. So before we get into your book, one of the themes of your book that crosses into the themes that we've been exploring on this show is that of the post-World War II consensus. Now, on our show, we've had this conversation now with R.R. Reno, Jonathan Pageau and Yoram Hazony. And a lot of the themes, well, with Pageau, it was about the symbolism, but with the other two, Reno and Hazony, it was about the philosophy after the World War II and this sort of rejection of fascism, Nazism, totalitarianism and authoritarianism, and embracing of the liberalism, freedom, and all of the things they deemed opposite to those. Now, that's, I think, resonated with audiences because I think it sort of explains a lot of the populist movement we're seeing worldwide. Trump in America, Brexit here, and I guess maybe you would say Farage here, and Javier Milei in Argentina. But there's a populist movement around the world, I think everyone would agree. And part of that, I think, well, on several levels, has been a reaction to the post-World War II consensus on the philosophical one. But one thing I'm not so aware of or not so educated on is the economic angle. So I thought, who better to have that conversation with than you? And in your book, you do explore some of this, particularly when I think this is very relevant, but President Nixon taking the dollar off the gold standard in the 70s. I think that's part of the same story. But I wondered what your analysis or your take is on the post-World War II economic consensus, whether you think there was something that happened with the economy at the same time as these other things were going on, these other big changes.
Well, Winston, I would say that money, not necessarily economics, money itself is at the heart of it all. I often say that money is the blood of a society, and for a society to be healthy, it has to have sound money. And what we've seen, it actually began earlier than World War II, but you can take 1945 as a starting point, if you like. And what we've seen is that the nature of money has changed over the last 70 years or so. And in 1945, when it became clear that the Allies were going to win the war, the nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in a hotel, and they agreed a new monetary order for the world after World War II. And John Maynard Keynes was there on behalf of the British, and he was arguing that the international monetary system should be based on gold. But the US got their way, and they would have the international monetary system based on the US dollar. So the US dollar would be tied to gold at $35 an ounce. So for every $35, you could exchange it for an ounce of gold with the Federal Reserve Bank. And other currencies had to tie themselves to within 1% of the US dollar. And that would be the global monetary order. But almost immediately, that sort of agreement started to unravel. Well, the agreement stayed there, but the US undermined itself, because what the US effectively did is it printed more money than it had gold to back it. And this began firstly as it was sending money overseas to try and rebuild countries after the Second World War in the form of aid. And then in the late 50s and 60s, US spending on its own welfare increased quite dramatically. And then, of course, it got involved in the Vietnam War and spending increased there. So that it was issuing more and more dollars. And eventually Charles de Gaulle was the sort of one of the ringleaders in all of this. And he started exchanging his dollars for gold. The dollars that France held. And at one point, he actually sent 2 battleships to New York to collect the gold. Can you imagine that now?
Yeah,
Can you imagine sending 2 battleships to New York now? I mean, it's just absurd.
Here's a quick word from today's sponsor, Ground News. Let's take a quick look at how the media is reporting on Trump's tariffs using Ground News. Left-leaning Democracy Now! Ran the headline, "Total random chaos of Trump's tariffs are not rebalancing US trade." We specifically partnered with Ground News because their app and website helped me and my team cut through media bias and get the full picture on any story like this one. There are over 160 articles published on Trump's tariffs, and we can access every single one through Ground News, complete with source context and key breakdowns. Meanwhile, right-leaning India Today led with, "Trump hits dozens of countries with tariffs, increases Canada's levies to 35%. Two very different narratives from the left and the right on the same story. Seeing all sides, regardless of political lean, is essential to making informed decisions and spotting bias. That's why Ground News' blind spot feed, which highlights stories underreported by either side, is such a powerful tool. I genuinely believe in what Ground News is doing, and I encourage you to check it out by scanning the QR code or visiting ground.news/Winston. If you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded, so by supporting my sponsors, you are also supporting this show.
There was so much pressure on the US dollar that eventually President Nixon in 1971 was forced to abandon the gold standard. And at this point, for the first time in history, no currency on the planet, except for the Swiss franc, was backed by anything tangible. And we were in what's called the fiat money era. And so what was money? Fiat means let it be so, Latin word. But money was effectively the law. It is the law that you must accept this money. Previously, it had always been the law, but previously it was backed by gold, so that it was a bit more credible, if you like. And ever since 1971, now prior to 1971, the US wasn't on a real gold standard because American citizens weren't actually allowed to own gold, which is a crime against American citizens that goes all the way back to 1932. But ever since then, you have seen the money supply just grow and grow and grow and grow. More and more money exists. And when you have more and more money chasing the same amount of goods, it effectively means that the price of those goods is going to go up. And you've seen the relentless appreciation in price of everything since 1971. Salaries have gone up, house prices have gone up, car prices have gone up. Even practically the only thing that's come down in price is telephone calls, bizarrely. But that's something else to do with digital technology. Even milk and egg. And really, things should have come down in price because we've got better at making them. So they should have come down in price. But they haven't. And that's just because there's more and more money chasing. And if you want to understand, one of Trump's biggest power bases is the Rust Belt, the working class of America. And he's constantly saying how these people have been cheated. They've been cheated by China. They've been cheated by this, that, and the other. No, what they've actually been cheated by is money. Because salaries in the States have gone up by roughly 10 times since 1970. They've gone up by 20 times in the UK, but that's because the pound has been roughly twice as weak. But house prices have gone up 20 times in the States. They've gone up 70 times in the UK since 1970, 70 times. So in the UK, they've gone up 3.5 times the rate of salaries. And that's why an ordinary UK citizen cannot afford to buy a house anymore. The middle-class lifestyle that a generation ago was affordable on just one salary now takes 2 salaries and a shed more debt. And so the working classes just feel like they're having to work harder and harder and getting left further and further behind. The monetary system causes inequality. It is a direct cause of it. And it's quite hard to explain, and it's certainly in populist terms. And so people don't generally understand it. But once you see how money has eroded society and causes this inequality, you immediately see why the working class feel like they're left behind, why there's so much anger, why people are resentful about this and that and the other. It is all caused by our system of money. Now, if you compare all of that to the 19th century, which is probably the golden age of Britain, if you like. And it saw at the beginning of the 19th century, people were gradually going from a serf-like existence on the farms, coming into the cities, working, the Industrial Revolution. The 19th century in Britain saw the emergence of a middle class that barely existed before, educated, and they went on and did incredible things. Wonderful inventors, scientists, chemists, doctors, artists, writers. It really, the second half of the 19th century really was a golden age for Britain. But if you look at the money that underpinned it, ever since 1821, we were on a gold standard, and the value of money more than doubled over the course of the century. When I say the value of money, your money bought you more than twice as much. So the price of goods, housing, everyday goods, clothing, it all fell constantly. We're so used to the price of everything going up. Through the 19th century, prices more than halved. And one of the things I have in the book is a chart of consumer prices. The only time they went up was during the American Civil War, just after the gold rushes. But apart from that, there was just this constant deflation. Prices came down. And it meant that if you went to work and you earned, a gold coin for your work, it meant that the value of that gold coin, you could save it and know that in a year or 2 or 3 years' time, the value of the work you had done would be retained, and you could go and buy just as much for your money as the work you put in. So the energy of your work was preserved, rather than now when oh my God, I'm losing 10% to inflation every year and so on and so forth. And so the whole dynamic of society was completely different. And if you go back through history and you look at every great empire, and it's usually the great empires that are the most innovative, the most inventive, the most entrepreneurial, produce the most scientific breakthroughs, the most artistic breakthroughs, and so on. They have always been underpinned by sound money. And declining money, fiat money, debasement of currency is a symptom of their decline. Most famously, the Roman Empire. And I'm afraid that's where the West is now. It's in decline, and we amongst Bitcoin, Bitcoin fixes this: save money, fix money, fix the world.
We'll come back to Bitcoin.
We come back to it, but I have this mantra that everything boils down to our system of money, and if we were able to fix the system of money, all the other problems that we face in the West, from division to even declining divorce rates, smaller families, it would all gradually fix itself.
Well, we'll definitely come back to that. So let's just go back to this change then, because it's quite a drastic picture you paint of the 2 centuries there. Now, you mentioned in passing 1932. Mm-hmm. Now, presumably you're referring to the New Deal under Franklin D. Roosevelt there.
Yes.
So if it is the case that there is this monetary system from the 19th century that is, as you say, and then a big change and turn away from that, are you putting that on 1932? And presumably, if so, it's because of the 1929 crash.
Yeah.
So was that? It's not really about the war; it's about the crash.
Well, what happened in 1932 was, we'll backpedal a few years. We'll go back to 1914, beginning of the First World War. Germany, France, and to an extent Britain. Britain didn't actually come off the gold standard, but it did really. It just withdrew gold from circulation. But Germany and France came off the gold standard in 1914, and all the other European countries did, in order to print the money that they needed to pay for the war. And I sort of see the First World War as the beginning of the end of Western Europe, as the sort of dominant culture in the world. That was the beginning of the decline of Western Europe relative to everything else, First World War. And that war could not have gone on to anything like the same extent that it did had those countries stuck to the discipline of gold, because there was not the gold to pay for it. And what enabled that war was coming off the gold standard and printing the money they needed through the issuance of debt and by other means as well. Mm-hmm. So coming off the gold standard enabled the First World War. And this is something you're never taught in history books. And after the First World War, all the European nations wanted to get back onto the gold standard, because they thought if they could get back on the gold standard, then everything would be just as it was before the war started. They didn't factor in the damage that the war had done. But America never came off the gold standard. It stayed on. And nations gradually went back onto the gold standard through the 1920s. Then we got the Wall Street crash, 1929. And almost immediately, by 1930 or 1931, 90% of the world's major currencies were on the gold standard, and by 1932, about 50% of them were off it. They all just had to abandon gold to deal with their problems. But Roosevelt was elected, and he never mentioned gold or his policies towards gold, what he was going to do with gold, during his election campaign. And then when he became president, he made various executive orders. And Americans all had to hand in their gold. They were ordered to hand in, because there were so many runs on American banks, people were going to the bank, exchanging their dollars for gold, taking their gold out of the banks because it was not safe in the banks, and keeping their gold at home. Roosevelt needed to recapitalize the banks, get the system working again. So he ordered Americans to hand in their gold, and they would be given US dollars in exchange. And Americans believed their government, they believed everything they were told, just as we did during COVID, for example, and loyal, abiding citizens that they were, they handed in their gold. Roosevelt gave them dollars in exchange, and then a year later, 9 months later, he just debased the US dollar by 40%. So effectively, he stole 60, 70% of American citizens' wealth. I mean, it was just an incredible theft. And it was illegal for Americans to own gold. It only became legal again in 1975.
Wow.
And it's incredible to think that all this time America was on a gold standard, but American citizens couldn't own gold. It was just a hypocritical gold standard, in other words. But so he stole the wealth of his people, and he used it to redo all the things he did in his New Deal.
Huh. Wow. Okay, so then we get to, let's go forward again. Mm-hmm. So we're in the post-war period now, and there's a lot of philosophers. I think the two most prominent here on the economic philosophers, that is the ones we hear about, who support or talk about what a kind of a very open, what the critical left will call neoliberalism, or the sort of academics and activists on the left call neoliberalism. But I think even those on the right see it as the sort of birth of globalization. It's basically total free markets and open enterprise, I suppose. That am I right in thinking that's part of this new philosophy that emerges after the Second World War? So Hayek, Mises, how do I fit those?
Yeah, the Austrian economists. Yeah. They were, when I say Austrian, they weren't necessarily Austrian nationality. I mean the Austrian school of economics, and they were big believers in sound money, because when you have sound money, you limit what governments can do. When a government is able to create money at no cost to itself, which is the system that we have now, the rest of us, if we want money, we have to work for it, we have to invest, we have to speculate, we have to find ways of making money. It's hard, it's not easy. But a government, it's slightly more complicated than that, but a government effectively can create money at no cost to itself.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have that situation where one body has this power to create money and the rest of society doesn't, it is inevitable that the body that has the power to create money will grow relative to everything else. And that is why you see this endless expansion of government, this endless bloating and all, this in the States, it's the deep state. In the UK, it's, the welfare state, the NHS, and government just grows as a percentage of GDP. And more people become dependent on the government in some way for their income. And so more and more people vote for it. There's a great quote by George Bernard Shaw, who did a wonderful service because he proved it's possible to have a career as both a philosopher, economist, and a comic writer. So he set the he set the thing before me. But he said a government promising to rob Peter to pay Paul can pretty much count on the support of Paul. And so you understand how that works.
When you say sound money, what do you mean?
Gold.
Okay. And so, sorry,
basically money that you can't print.
Okay. You're describing the state sort of bloating, which I think everyone recognizes, particularly today. That's part of the discourse in America. That's what Doge was set out to kind of take down, and we're having similar conversations here in Britain. But isn't that the opposite of what someone like Friedrich Hayek was espousing? Wasn't he saying smaller government?
Yeah, they wanted limited government.
They wanted limited government, and yet... So these philosophers were saying one thing, and yet we went a completely different direction to them. Right. So how is it that
their counsel was ignored?
So do you put that down to like it's a snowball, and once it started, it just never stopped, and no one had the courage to intervene?
It's you have to change the system. It's almost beyond. It's just beyond even under Reagan and Thatcher, who both were small. We look back at them now as champions of the small state, and if only we could go back to Thatcher and Reagan. But even under Thatcher and Reagan, the state grew just by not as much.
Did it actually?
Yes, just by not as much as it. The rate of growth slowed.
Right. Okay.
I can't give you precise numbers by how much it grew, but I know for a fact it grew.
So in that case, the significance of Reagan and Thatcher and the kind of attempts for trickle-down economics. And again, I'm sort of hearing this left-wing activists in my ears saying that these were the chief villains of this neoliberal project. But you're saying you're arguing that they actually didn't really
They
change
slowed
much.
the rate of growth, but the growth nevertheless continued.
They slowed the rate.
They slowed the rate of growth of the state.
Of the state,
but the state carried on growing.
Okay, right.
There was more state by the end of it than there was at the beginning of it.
Okay, so then, how is it that at no point in this long period, how is it that it's continued on this trajectory for so long?
I would argue because of the money system. Because if there's a money system where the governments can't print it, they can't issue shed loads of debt against it, there's only so much gold.
Mm-hmm.
And once the gold has run out, the money's run out, then it limits what a government is capable of doing.
Mm-hmm.
But if it can just run up deficit, issue more and more debt, grow the money supply, there's just no restraint.
Right, okay. So how to fix the system of money then?
Well, you hear a lot of gold bugs talk about going back to a gold standard.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not actually an argument that I make, because what the problem with gold, I brought some with me.
Yeah.
So here's a gold coin. This is a Victorian sovereign. It now costs, it was the old pound coin effectively. And it now costs £650 to buy the old pound coin.
Is it really?
That's how much money's been debased by. Have you ever held a gold sovereign before?
I've not. Wow.
And
there's Queen Vic on the front?
That's Queen Victoria, yes.
Bless her.
But the problem with that is that now, as soon as I give you that gold sovereign, all the wealth is now in your hands. That's the beauty of gold. Like it's a bearer asset. Whoever has the gold has the wealth. There's the saying, whoever has the gold makes the rules.
Uh-huh.
So it's one of the reasons why gold is so stolen, because once you've got the gold, you got it. You got the wealth. Whereas if I was issuing a check, would rely on a third party, if that makes sense. So it's wealth in and of itself. That's actually 22 carat. This one here is a Justinian solidus. It's a bezant, a Byzantine gold coin.
Really?
And that is 24 carat gold, 1,500 years old, just as shiny as it was when it was first minted.
Wow.
But what you are holding there, that is pure wealth.
Huh.
That is all gold is. Has no other use, but it's just pure wealth. Now, but the problem is people don't use, it's cash, in other words. People don't use cash anymore. Everything is digital. And so you could build a payment system on top of gold. And in fact, they've already, various techie people, there are already cryptocurrencies and so on based on, built on top of gold. But they're just, the beauty of this is it relies on nobody else. There's no third-party liability. There's no, it's just wealth in and of itself. Once you build a payment system on top of gold, it's somebody else's liability. And so eventually, sooner or later, that's why gold standards fail, because they're payment systems built on top of gold rather than actual gold, if that makes sense. And in fact, even though gold isn't officially money anymore, we still use it in that central banks still hold shed loads of gold, individuals still hold it. So it's still, there's a great little bit of verse that used to be taught: money is a matter of functions four, a medium, a measure, a standard, a store. Now, so money is a medium of exchange, but it's also a store of value. And so gold's lost its role as medium of exchange. It never really was medium. It was usually silver and copper. But as store of value, we all still use it. Central banks still hold it. America has 70-80% of its foreign exchange holdings held in gold. The UK has rather less gold. China has gold holding. Central banks hold gold. Investors hold gold. There's probably, I don't know if you have a pension, but your pension fund probably has a little bit of gold held on your behalf. I've got my little gold coins in my pocket. So it's never lost its store of value side of money. But I don't see us going back to a gold standard, because it would just be, we wouldn't be using gold in day-to-day life, because we just don't use cash anymore. So it would be a digital payment system backed by gold. But gold will still have some kind of role to play in the money systems of the future. I don't quite know what they are, but the money systems of the future are going to be based on something digital, possibly Bitcoin. So because just money has gone digital. So, but if there was a way, I don't actually know what it is, but if there was a way of using gold to limit what governments are able to do, that's what gold has always done in the past. And a true, massive gold bag who thinks, there are gold bugs who think it is inevitable that we go back to a gold standard because money has always been gold. And the other thing you see is that money becomes a tool of war. So if two countries go to war, one of the first things they attack is the other country's money system. And so money, like, for example, during World War II, the Germans printed loads of counterfeit pounds. In fact, counterfeit pounds were more common than proper pounds at one stage.
Trying to cause inflation.
Yeah, and they were going to try and actually fly planes over Britain and just dump the notes in the country, around the country, but they never actually did that. But they all were used throughout Europe, although not actually in Britain. And when America rose up against, unwisely in my view, against Britain in the late 18th century, the British just plied America with counterfeit money. And so it's just a tool of war. And if, for example, China has much more gold than it says it does. If China ever decides it's going to get, America confiscated Russian dollars and took Russia out of SWIFT, out of the international payment system, after it invaded Ukraine. So it always weaponizes its money. It uses its dollar as a sort of carrot and stick to get countries to behave themselves and do what they're supposed to do. But if China and America ever go to war, China could quite easily turn around and declare its real gold holdings, which are much higher than it says they are. And I go into much more detail on it in the book, and go, actually, we've got more gold than you. And actually, you haven't audited your gold and we have. And our gold is of good delivery quality and your gold isn't. That would dramatically undermine the US dollar and the power of the US dollar. We don't realize it, but where the West is really, really vulnerable is in the fact that our money is not backed by anything. And so if we ever get involved with a big conflict and it seems that sooner or later we're going to get involved in a conflict with China, probably later, but we are really, really vulnerable because our money is not backed by anything.
Are you turning healthy fruits into highly unhealthy fruits without even realizing it? Fruit can be one of the healthiest things you can put into your body, but the majority of Americans are guilty of making this single mistake that can counteract all of the health benefits of fruit. Some fruits can help with occasional constipation, reduce bloating, and even help burn calories. Others can wreak havoc on your digestive system and energy levels. I came across this viral presentation from world-renowned heart surgeon Dr. Stephen Gundry, which explains everything. I learnt a lot. It has made me rethink my brekkie. I'm going to put a link for you all to watch it because I think this is important information. Go watch it right now at thehealthyfat.com/win. Oh, and by the way, eliminating these specific fruits could forever help increase energy levels, decrease brain fog, support digestion, and even lose weight. Dr. Gundry has lost 70 pounds himself using his research and has kept the weight off for over 20 years and counting. His digestive issues are gone. His health, I am told, is fantastic, and he feels younger and healthier today than he did in his 40s. His video has been watched now by over 20 million people. And you can watch and learn more over at thehealthyfat.com/win. It's linked at the bottom of the video, but he'll teach you exactly how he's kept his weight off for free. Now, back on with the show. Can I bring us back, Dom, to the consensus? Because I'm just trying to get my head around this post-World War II consensus. So,
sure.
Do you think then I'd be right in thinking that part of the philosophy that took us on this route of a more and more bloated government was the same as that which thought after the World War II, we can't let people have too much control. We need to save people themselves from their sort of worst and more sort of base instincts. And so if we, the noble elite, can control government, can control more parts of people's lives, then we can protect against the kind of evil forces of authoritarianism. Do you think that? I'm trying to get my head into the philosophies that took us down this road.
Yeah, I think probably World War II, the world wars, the two world wars and the consequences of those two world wars, one of the things they gave birth to was the rise of the planner. And
the technocrat.
The technocrat. And technocrats, as a rule, don't like gold. Whereas economists can come along and say, we've got MMT, modern monetary theory, or such and such a monetary policy. Even Milton Friedman wasn't a gold bug. He was a big champion of most kind of small government, conservative values, libertarian values, if you like. But he always felt that money shouldn't have a cost of production to it. Mm-hmm. Whereas a lot of people think money should. But yeah, those that would plan economic policy and plan this and so on and so forth tend to be averse to using gold and sound money, independent money, as a term I use a lot. Whereas those who are believers in free markets, organic, laissez-faire, what will be, the market will right itself, the market is efficient, all those kind of philosophies tend to be pro gold and pro sound money.
So then I also kind of want to understand the globalization aspect of this sort of post-war period as well. So quite crucial, I think, is when China joins the WTO in 2001. And even before that, there's the battle for Seattle. So the old lefties were protesting. I think even Nancy Pelosi was involved in this. There's an instinct of the working people against this globalization. And if you listen to the theories of various populists, particularly, I'd say Steve Bannon, he was very eloquent and I think precise in this in his Oxford Union speech. He talks about the things that inspired the populist movement of this century that we're experiencing at the moment. One was the failed $1 trillion never-ending neocon wars, and one was,
which wouldn't be possible if America had its money tied to gold.
Another was the 2008 crash, and more specifically, the $1 trillion bailout of the 2008 crash.
That wouldn't be possible either.
And the other was globalization and particularly opening up the markets to China. So that sort of theory, I mean, it seems like it's pretty tied then to what happened with gold.
Well, the purists would have said, and they did say, the banking system is broken. Let the banking system go bust, and something much better and cleaner and more efficient will emerge in its place. But instead, they did everything they could to preserve it. They printed all the money that they printed, and quantitative easing and zero interest rate policies and all the rest of it. And the result was rising inequality. And, I don't think inequality is necessarily bad. I think poverty is worse than inequality, if you know what I mean. And if Elon Musk becomes gazillionaire 20 times over, but he makes life much better for everybody, then fine. But even so, there's different types of inequality. And I think what happens is politicians and policymakers, a lot of the time, just take the path of least resistance, the easiest option that is available to them at the time. And I don't think any politician wanted to be the guy who let the banks go bust, because they were just too scared of what the consequences would be. And so they did everything they could to save it with, Gordon Brown, I Saved the World, that famous slip. And so the path of the least resistance was to bail it out, print a little bit more, run a little bit more of a deficit, and just keep the system going. But the purists, of which I'm one, will say you have to let it go.
You should have let the banks fail.
I think so.
And bail out the people who had ended, 9 million people who
I don't know.
Fall out? No?
I don't know. That it's easy to say that, and then you just see people losing their houses and losing their this, and no politician wants to be responsible for that. But there were ways, and you're not talking to the greatest expert in this, but there were ways of returning depositors' money to them while letting everything else take its course. But in fact, it was the biggest beneficiaries of the bailouts were the investment banks who were over-leveraged.
Yeah. You touched on inequality there, and I do want to look at that because it comes up, of course, again and again. And the point you make there, you'd rather have inequality than poverty. I think Thatcher made that argument.
She did.
In Parliament, famously.
To Kinnock, yeah.
Yeah, right.
You want everyone down here. Doing the thing with their hands.
Right, exactly. But it is something that comes up, and in Britain there's a YouTuber economist called Gary Stevenson, who's become very popular and talks a lot about inequality, and it's also part of that discourse has been the idea of bringing back a wealth tax and inheritance tax, and but it's probably true that inequality is worse than it's ever been. I wondered if you had a sort of take on what they get right, what the left gets right about inequality, or what they get wrong. And what someone like Gary Stevenson gets right and wrong.
I don't watch his videos. Occasionally a clip comes up on my Twitter, but I sort of vaguely know what his arguments are. And I think where the left and the right can all agree, everyone can feel it, is that something is not right. We can all feel something is not right, and everyone's angry, and we just know that something isn't right. And where we can't agree is on solution. And the solution of the left is generally more government. We need to raise taxes, and we need more government to do this, this, and this. And the solution of the right or the libertarian is less government.
Except if you look in Britain, the solution of the right-wing governments has been more
exactly,
and more taxing,
and what is right and what is left.
Right.
Was why I use the word libertarian. But precisely, I mean, the Conservative government of the last however many years was basically a social democrat government, and they thought they were clever because they just stole Labour's ground all the time. But so government grew. It was supposed to be a right wing. Conservatives were supposed to be right wing in a small state, but the Tory party was anything but. But yes, I would argue that most of these problems that we have, as I say, they come down to our system of money, which is an issuance of government. But so many of our problems, why is the health service so bad? Because it's run by the government. If supermarkets were run by the government, supermarkets would be bad, but on the whole, supermarkets are pretty good. And, why is our education system so bad? Well, because it's run by the government. And, if you look at private schools, they're actually pretty good most of the time. And you look at private tutors, they're even better. And people go in to fulfill their potential in a much better way. So what's the solution? Oh, get rid of private schools. What? Surely we should get rid of state schools because they're the ones that don't work. Oh, but people can't. So the solution of the left is always more government. And I would argue that government is the problem. So why do you want to raise taxes and increase the possibility of the body that has made a mess of all these things to make an even bigger mess? I mean, it's just so basic.
Well, the proof, if it's in the pudding, is in Javier Milei and what he's doing in Argentina. This is a country that's had a lot of government and a lot of left-wing government for, I think, over a century before Javier Milei was voted in by working people.
Yep.
This was a movement, very much a popular movement of the working classes, as I think one might say, if we're to use Marxist language. And he has formed some sort of man-made miracle. Is he your sort of dream version of?
I've got a Javier Milei T-shirt that I wear proudly as I walk around the streets of Broccoli.
No doubt with a chainsaw on.
Yes.
Yeah.
And afuera, it says on it.
Yeah.
And I just think Javier Milei, it's incredible to think that at the turn of the 20th century, Argentina was as rich as the US. It was the most extraordinarily wealthy country. And, it had because of its natural wealth, largely. And it had we built the railways there. The British, even despite the Falklands, the British are really well perceived out there. They're really well liked. And, you talk to saying, oh, you built that when you go around. And you go around Buenos Aires and it is just the most majestic city that I have. Have you been to Buenos Aires?
I have, yeah.
And so what an incredible city it is. And it's just on a whole, it's like Paris and London, but just on a much greater scale. And it's just everywhere you drive, it's like, oh, another magnificent square, oh, another magnificent building. And it's just incredible, the wealth that was there. And they got blighted with socialism. They were also affected by the fact that farming and commodity prices generally are cyclical. And their economy, if you like, was over-leveraged to commodities. But there are plenty of other commodity-rich countries that survived it and grew. But one mistake after another, and they just gradually became more and more corrupt. And, how many times did they have hyperinflations in Argentina? I've lost count, but it must be close to 10. And then they'd reissue the peso and then it would collapse again. And then you had Javier Milei, who was born of the Austrian School of Economics, anarcho-capitalist, but very much a champion of Hayek and von Mises and all those guys you mentioned, who would go on TV and he would argue with other commentators about what the right thing to do about Argentina's problems were. And because it was always him against 4 or 5 others, he just learnt to shout over them. So that's why he's got this kind of really aggressive afuera. He's got all his catchphrases and so on, because they're just born of. And I'm sure you've been. I've been in there talking. I've been into the BBC sometimes talking about a book, and you'll just find yourself in a room with 5 other people, and all 5 share that kind of BBC worldview, and you're on your own, and you just find yourself one arguing against 5, and it's just really, really hard.
Yeah.
So he was doing that, and his arguments just got more and more bulletproof. His philosophy just got tighter and tighter and tighter. And I think one of the problems that we saw with successive conservative leaders is, you know what Javier Milei's first principles are. So even if he's confronted with a decision and he doesn't actually know anything about what he's making a decision about, which must happen to leaders all the time.
Sure.
You just fall back on your first principles and just go, what would Hayek do? Or what does the anarcho-capitalist philosophy say here? And I remember talking to Nigel Farage. We were just going on stage on the Brexit celebration night, and I was talking about this with Theresa May, who was Prime Minister at the time. And I was saying the problem she's got, she just wants to keep everyone happy. She panders. And he just went, no first principles. And, that exactly sums it up. And I just think that's the problem with we need a leader with strong first principles. But the problem is a leader can't just come along, even if they think it, and say the things that Javier Milei has said, because the media will crucify them. They'll just get misrepresented and smeared, and everyone will turn them into a laughingstock. But it was because Milei's route to success was like through social media and through the TV. And so by the time he got to his position of power, nothing he said was going to surprise everyone. And he sort of built up his following and built up his philosophy, particularly amongst kids. by the way. One thing that's going to save us is that, everyone thinks kids are left-wing and Labour's got this new law with the 16-year-olds voting. But actually the kids are surprisingly, right-wing and they're not.
They are in Argentina anyway.
Well, they are, but they seem to be here. Farage is like the go-to guy, and nobody's watching Starmer videos on TikTok. They're all watching Farage videos. So maybe that will backfire. We'll find out. But anyway, by the time Milei got to doing the job he was doing, there were no surprises. And then the big surprise was that the big surprise when he got into power, he did what he said he was going to do.
Right.
Oh my God, he meant it.
Well, and even bigger is that it seems to be working.
Of course. It really is working. It's a tremendous success.
So can this happen in Britain?
I don't think it can.
And why not?
I just think we're too entrenched. The media has too much power. Unless somebody just comes through, like Milei did. I don't know who that person is. It probably needs to be maybe 25 or 30.
I don't think it's just...
I just don't think Farage is going to do it. I love Farage. He's a friend. We text each other. But he's kind of doing what Conservatives did, where he's stealing Labour's thunder all the time and owning this policy and that policy, and everything he does, it's just going to be. And he's a great tactician, and he knows what he needs to do to get elected. But I don't see, and he's a Thatcher. I know he's a Thatcherite. He used to be a gold metals trader. I've seen him at gold conferences before he was famous, giving talks about gold, and we'll end up on a gold standard. But I don't see where we're going to get down. Look, at the turn of the 20th century, in the heyday of Britain, government spending was, taxes were at 10% of GDP. And that, so 90% of what you earned, you kept. And welfare was provided by the cooperative societies back then.
You're turning up
the friendly society.
The last century.
At the turn of, in 1900, yeah. And taxes in Western Europe were at 10%. And now if you factor in inflation, they're well over 50%. And I just don't see how we get back to 20%. We just need to either total collapse or, we need splinter nations to break away or something. And, if we could go back to the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy or something and have the independent state of Kernow or Cornwall or something, and then Cornwall could have low tax, a bit like it happens in America to an extent. And Cornwall has zero income tax in Cornwall. So everyone moves to Cornwall, and then, Devon and Somerset look at that and go, oh God, actually it's working really well. So we'll copy it. And then it spreads that way. But I just don't see with the UK as it currently works. I just don't see how we do it. Well, there's even with a Thatcher.
What are these sort of free port zones? This sort of might be no, that's not going to do it?
Well, yeah, but it's just, there's been talk of these for ages and then they never really happened.
But so another problem, it seems to me, is that Britain has a core that is and will always be sort of socialist. That is quite an important part of the British spirit. And I look at Jeremy Corbyn. Last week he was...
I would say 20-25% of the country is pretty sympathetic to the socialist worldview.
Corbyn was in Japan last week because it was the 80th anniversary of the
Hiroshima.
And part of me, I look at that and I think, wow. So like adding to his list of the good guys are Hamas, Hezbollah, is now Imperial Japan's on it, I suppose.
Were they the good guys?
He said that, he's called them his friends before. And so, he's someone who's, it seems to me, has a worldview that is the inversion of what it is to be pro-British. And yet,
I've got to check.
And yet he is so popular. He crushes it when it came to the election in 2019. He way more votes than Starmer got years later. So it seems, for me, he symbolises that there is a core of Britain, as you said, 25%.
I agree.
That will always be socialist.
I agree.
Right.
And you look at the socialist movement that began in the early 20th century. A lot of it started in Glasgow. And spread from there. And you look at where Glasgow was, in the early 20th century, maybe just on the eve of World War I. Glasgow was like China is now. It produced something like 25% of the world's ships. It was just the most extraordinarily wealthy place. And Glasgow is just the heart of invention and entrepreneurial spirit and goodness. Look at things that are in the world. Like half of the things in the world were invented by Scots. There's just incredible people. And then, it started, I think, in the Springer sewing machine factory in 1912 or something like that. So I agree. We've always had this sort of buccaneering entrepreneurial spirit. We've had a great tradition of exploration and a great tradition of doing entrepreneurial things. But we've also got this instinct as well.
So I guess,
but yeah. By the way, just talking about what you said about Imperial Japan, there's I've got a chapter about them in the book, and what happened to the Japanese gold, and it's one of the great mysteries. But if you look at Japanese war crimes, they were a level up from the Nazis.
Yes,
I mean they really were bad. I mean, not saying the Nazis were good or anything like that, but the Japanese was like a whole level up.
Yeah,
and and one of the great mysteries in the history of gold is what happened to
what did happen to their gold.
We don't know.
And that's during the Second War.
Mm-hmm. They everywhere they went, like the Nazi, I mean, it was such a huge thing is what happened to the Nazi gold. And a lot of the Nazi gold ended up in Argentina. Some of it went back to the Allies. Some of it's probably sitting in lakes at the bottom of the Alps. Some of it's, there's some of it. There's so many documentaries what happened to the Nazi gold. I've narrated about 50 of them myself. and it's all in the, all of it. I couldn't put it all in the book. Otherwise it'd be about this long a book. But, some of the best stories there in the book. But the Japanese, as they took Southeast Asia, they had entire state bodies built up for the confiscation of gold, and they were sending it back to Japan, and then all the ships going back to Japan were getting torpedoed, so they started sending it to the Philippines because they thought that at the end of the war they were going to get the Philippines. They thought that was the sort of what they'd get to stop fighting everyone. And they built all these. They had their own soldiers and slaves built all these tunnels in the Philippines, and they put the gold in there. And then they would just explode the tunnels with the slaves and their own soldiers in there. They would just explode the tunnels so that nobody knew where the tunnels were. And so, and every now and then somebody finds some of this gold. And a lot of it's thought to be in there. Some people go, no, the CIA took it and America used it to prop up the dollar and in the fight against communism and la. There's so many conspiracy theories going what happened to the Japanese gold. And that's one of the problems with gold is like you take this coin and you melt it down. You don't know what the history of this gold is. And this gold has been here since before the Earth was formed. It's older than the Earth itself. It's you can't destroy gold. So, and it was first created when the solar system was created, billions and billions of years ago. And it's been there ever since. It has literally seen everything. And you melt it down, you just don't know its provenance. So you look at like central banks around the world, some of that gold in central banks' holdings was probably stolen Jewish gold, without a shadow of a doubt, because the Nazis would steal the Jewish gold and they'd melt it down and they put it in because Nazi gold bars weren't acceptable in Switzerland, they would stamp it with 1920s German stamps so that it was acceptable in Switzerland. That's how it's so it was fake stamps gold. And I'm no doubt there'll be stolen Jewish gold in the vaults of central banks around the world, no doubt.
But you're not suggesting, as you've already said, that we're going to go back onto the gold standard.
Gold's going to have a role to play, but this idea of money being tied to gold, it might have to happen if there is some kind of inflationary currency collapse as a result of international conflict or governments printing. Like I've been saying, there's going to be people have been saying there's going to be an inflationary collapse since before the financial crisis. And I thought it was going to happen. And then the financial crisis came along and I thought, this is it. Finally, we're here. And then they bailed out the banks and it was like, oh, it didn't happen. And so I've been hearing that story for so long. I'm sort of slightly cynical. But as soon as you start to look at the numbers, you go, how can the system survive? It's just not possible. So it might be that in some kind of panic, they need to go back and go, you can exchange your pound for such and such amount of gold. Well, that might happen, but it would be such a huge. They'd have to revalue gold up by such a huge amount in order to make that work.
In your estimation, then, do you sort of see, and I sort of thinking out loud here, but the rise of cryptocurrencies and particularly Bitcoin as the natural human response to wanting to have that sort of solid currency, 100%. So to speak. That is, the governments won't do it, so the people have done it.
Yes,
it's kind of been a libertarian response.
No. It was stated, like the Satoshi Nakamoto stated it quite. Bitcoin was born in reaction to the money printing that went on in the financial crisis, no question, and it was born out of a loathing for the evils of the damage that inflation does. And Nakamoto actually said, escape the arbitrary, what was it? I can't remember the exact quote. Escape the arbitrary something of inflation. He wrote that in one of his posts.
Huh.
And it was born out of that. And so if everything good happens in the free market. We don't have motor cars because of the government. We don't have trains. They're all born by inventors and so on. And Bitcoin was born as a means to escape fiat money, and it's an international money. It's borderless. You can send. I sent a payment of 1 sat, which would be 1/20th of 1p, roughly. That smaller payment to somebody in Australia. And, a micropayment of that amount. It's the implications of that are being able to send such tiny amounts of money. But I could just send $1 billion to somebody in Australia as well, and I wouldn't need anyone's permission. And it would take about a minute if I had $1 billion to send. That's the hitch. I don't have to have that. But it's a brilliant new monetary system, and it's emerged quite organically without planning. It's been a completely open source thing. Governments have looked at it and they turned a blind eye to it at first because they weren't quite sure, and then regulators, planners, the FCA in the UK banned it. Well, they didn't ban it, but they just made it impossible for UK citizens to invest in it. And other regulatory bodies have been slightly more favourable, particularly in the US, and it's just gradually entering the mainstream. But it is an organic system of money, and you can use it for payments. You can use it as a store of wealth. It hasn't quite got unit of account status yet, but that will come in due course. It's still too early for it to have unit of account status.
I was just on holiday in South Lebanon.
Oh, yeah.
Deep in Hezbollah country.
Okay.
Quite literally, every 10 meters, there's a Hezbollah flag flying. Rather than being a narco-capitalist, it's sort of a narco-Islamo-fascist. But
it's authoritarian, I would say.
In an Islamo way, not that authoritarian, but it's more like carnage, like nothing works. They've got terrible, and Lebanon has a terrible currency crisis.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's $1. I think it was like 1 million Lebanese pounds to $1 or something 100,000 Lebanese pounds for a dollar.
It's been hit with inflation many times.
But we see then naturally what pops up is these Bitcoin shops all over the place, all over Hezbollah country. It's another version of the natural response to the failure of the state, as you described. So maybe when you say in 2008, you were hoping that was going to be the moment that there would be a turn. Well, there actually was. It just wasn't how you thought it. It came from the people.
Yes,
right.
Fair enough.
It came from the people.
I thought we'd see a collapse, but you're absolutely right in that regard. And in fact, one of the major use cases of Bitcoin is in places where there is a huge amount of humanitarian need, and the local money has lost all its value. So, for example, that might be Venezuela, that might be Palestine, it might be Lebanon, as you say. Now, where Bitcoin is so important in these countries is, firstly, people can hold a money that doesn't require anyone else's permission. So they don't need the permission of their rulers to have it. And it keeps its value in a way that inflating currencies don't. Now, let's just say, and this is not, I don't want to get involved in the politics of the Israel-Palestine conflict, but there are people in Palestine who have, I talked to a Palestinian guy about this, it's just impossible to send money to somebody in Palestine who, you might have a family member or something who needs help. You can't send them money because the bank wants to know why you're sending them money. The banking system's long since fallen apart anyway. There are all sorts of bribes you have to pay on the way through, and all these different levels that you have to go through to eventually get your money, that by the time you get your money, it's all had all the sides shaved off and there's barely anything left. But you can just send Bitcoin to people. And all they need is a mobile phone, and everyone in Palestine, whether it's by solar panels or whatever, they all still able to use their mobile phones. Bizarrely, it's one of the few things, and they'll use solar powers to power them up and so on. And so you can send money, and so it's a life raft for some people, and that's again, it's where government money falls short because of there's so much regulation involved. People can't get through the system. So it's a real life raft for people in need, whether it's in Lebanon, as you say, or Palestine or Venezuela, where they have hybrid, anywhere where there's, an authoritarian regime and people in need, without a proper money, Bitcoin is a life raft.
So what should the relationship be between government and, let's say, Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies? And should there be a government-backed... I sort of, it's not a world I fully know. I'm kind of new to it. But what is the correct relationship?
The correct relationship to everything we've talked about in this program is money and state should be separated. They should be two separate things. It almost doesn't matter what money is, as long as it is separate from the state. Because money should be money. It should be a means of exchange and a store of value, and eventually a unit of account. But when the state gets involved, it becomes a political tool. And that is, governments have always used it as a political tool, and they shouldn't. So that they'll use it as we talked about in war to affect certain policies. They'll run a deficit to pay for this and that spending. It just gets used as political, and that is not what money should be. And so the mantra of both the gold bugs and the Bitcoiners is that we need to separate money and state.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that quite idealistic?
Yes.
And so it's not realistic then, right?
Well, we have gold and we have Bitcoin, and they're both functioning very well. And that is money functioning separate of the state. What could eventually happen if we have a currency crisis in the UK, which is, we've had plenty of them before, is that you will see Bitcoin will actually get the blame, and gold will actually get the blame. Like I can predict that with great certainty, and it'll be from that 20-25% of Gary Stevens' mates who start saying, it's the fault of the Bitcoiners that this crisis in the pound has happened. No, it is the fault of the people managing the pound. They printed too much of it.
How does it work in Salvador with Bukele? Because he's sort of the Bitcoin president.
Yeah,
and he's invited. I see him posing before Bitcoin symbols, and it's kind of part of the revolution there. I actually don't know very much about what's going on in Salvador, but how is the relationship between what he's building there with his nation and crypto, and specifically Bitcoin?
Well, I think Bukele is a bit more authoritarian right, whereas Milei is sort of hardcore libertarian. And Milei at the moment, I think he attempted some cryptocurrency and it went tits up, and a lot of people lost a lot of money, and so he's probably a bit more wary. But Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are different. But Bukele, you see the way he puts those people in prison, and it's pretty hardcore. And he's going to take prisoners from other countries around the world. That's going to be one of his main exports.
Yeah, really taking them from America.
Yeah, I mean it's quite terrifying when you think about it. But anyway, El Salvador and a lot of those Central American countries, I'm not entirely sure of the history there, but I know they've had various problems with currency collapses, and so they've ended up using the US dollar as their currency. And that means they're in the control of the US, they're beholden to US monetary policy and so on. But at least the people have a functioning system of money. And South and Central Americans all trust the US dollar. It's just currency out there. And particularly in the countries that have had inflations. And so El Salvador was using the US dollar at one point, but it was always in the hands of the IMF, and he was always owing the IMF money, and there were always problems. And he's a big Bitcoiner, and they've got all this unused volcanic geothermal power there that they can tap into. They've just got these huge energy resources that are just sitting there unused. And so he started using them for Bitcoin mining operations. And then he sort of made Bitcoin legal tender. So it was legal to use Bitcoin in shops, and people could pay their taxes and settle their debts in Bitcoin. And he started holding, his country started holding its natural reserves, its national reserves in Bitcoin as well. And obviously, every time the Bitcoin price goes down, and it's volatile, so it happens, everyone goes, Bukele, what a disaster you've been for your country. And every time the Bitcoin price goes up, it's like, ha, 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 look, our national reserves are way bigger than yours. But a good story, by the way. Hungary, all its confiscated Bitcoins confiscated from drug dealing, it sold them all in 2018. If it had kept those Bitcoins, that would be enough now to settle the entire country's national debt.
Wow.
Yeah. So Bukele is, and I don't think the Bitcoin as a payment system, having everyone, I think he gave everyone wallets and on their phones and gave everyone a tiny bit of Bitcoin and encouraged people to use them. And I don't think that's been a huge success. I think it's a failure, but I don't think it's been a huge success. Just people using it on a day-to-day basis in the way that they use US dollars. But even though I could just zap you a little bit of Bitcoin if we put our phones together now, that's kind of not what Bitcoin is for. It's not for buying coffees in coffee shops and taxis, even though it can be used for that. It's money for the internet. It's not money for the real world, if that makes sense. But again, a lot of Bitcoiners would have a go at me for saying that, and so you can use it, but that hasn't entirely worked, that side of things. But in terms of shoring up the country's finances and him pulling away from, you kind of got to compare it to the neighbours. So you're going to go, how's El Salvador doing? How's Nicaragua doing? How's Costa Rica doing? How's Honduras doing? How's Guatemala doing? And I think El Salvador, which was pretty much always the basket case, even by South American standards. I remember watching that film Salvador when I was a student with James Woods, great film. But I think El Salvador is sort of pulling away from its neighbours. So broadly speaking, it's been successful. Yeah.
Trump launched Trump coin.
Yeah. What was that all about?
This seems to me, as someone who is sympathetic to Trump, I will say,
yeah,
I'll admit my bias from the go. This seems to me to be not okay, and I don't think it's actually illegal what he's done technically, as far as I understand, but it seems to be needless and looks corrupt. So it would look corrupt from his detractors. He's created this coin. He's profiting from his position, and I don't think they've withdrawn from it, but he has the potential to make a lot of money. And his value, his self-worth, his value has gone up dramatically.
Yeah, it's one of his sons who's got him into it, isn't it?
Is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Probably a Baron thing. So I wondered what your take on the Trump coin thing was.
I kind of agree with you. I just think you didn't need to do that.
Yeah.
You got enough money.
Yeah.
And you're going to as a result of being US president, you're going to make so much money anyway. Did you really need to do that? And so that was kind of what I thought. But I say that without knowing anything about it.
Right, okay.
And now, but my mate, who does know everything about it, says it was a flex.
It's a flex. Right, okay.
So,
Let's see.
There's a lot of things that went on in those first 50 or 100 days that sort of, even Doge itself. There was a lot of things with this is going to happen, and then nothing came of a lot of them.
Yeah. Well, one thing that has come, and I think this is relevant to the first part of our conversation when it regards to the post-war consensus, is that he brought in his famous tariffs. That's his favorite word. He told us on, I think, the Joe Rogan Experience. And even though there was a total panic at the beginning, if you look at it now, it looks like it's going very well. He's set, I think in July, he's pulled in $30 billion from tariff revenue. And he's on course to maybe hit $300 billion for the year. Now, if you look at the percentage of value coming to the federal revenue before the Second World War, there was very little from. It was almost entirely from tariffs. Particularly First World War, look, it's almost entirely from tariffs. I've got this little graph to show you. Then we have the war.
US government revenue. Till they introduced income tax in 1913, it was like 90% tariffs.
It was 90% tariffs. And this seems to be a huge part of you can see it on the graph exactly. I'll throw the asset up so people can see it. The change that happens after the war and the sort of introduction of income and the kind of turn away from tariffs. And here we go, here another graph here where the massive decline in income from tariff. So this seems to be part of the post-World War II consensus being flipped, and this is seemingly might be a success. Maybe it's too early to say, but it seems like it. But I just wondered if you had an appraisal of this.
Well, until 1942, most Americans were not touched by income tax. It was only with the Revenue Act of 1942. They brought income tax in for the first time in 1913, but it only hit the richest Americans. But in the Revenue Act of 1942, and there's a song, there was a big propaganda campaign that came with the introduction of income tax. And there was a video with Donald Duck happily going in to pay his income tax. And there was a song written by Irving Berlin, sung by Gene Autry, called I Paid My Income Tax Today. And it contains the lyric, 1,000 planes to bomb Berlin, they got to be paid for, I chipped in.
Wow.
And that, like, if you ever saw the link between war and tax, and I paid my income tax today. I mean, it's so dark. And it tells you what governments use taxes for. And one of the things is to wage war. Now, obviously, the situation in 1942 was rather different. But like all these things, it was brought in as a temporary measure and it just stayed there. And one of the problems with income tax, why it's been such a successful tax from the point of view of the collector, is it's an easy tax to collect. It's an easy tax to impose because, like, if you're working for a company, I make the company responsible for collecting the tax from you. And if the company doesn't do it, they get in trouble. So they collect the tax because they don't want to get in trouble. You never see the money. You know, your taxes are deducted at source. If you have to pay income tax after the event, it's a much harder tax to collect. But because of America's resistance to income taxes, all through the 19th century, the federal government in the states was tiny, and most taxes were collected locally at the state level. And at the federal level, taxes were very low. So it meant US federal government was very, very limited. And that's one of the reasons why America was so successful. And I think one of the ways of interpreting the Constitution is that there should be no income tax. This is one of the disputed things in the Constitution. But if you look at the lead up to the US Civil War, you're always taught that war was about slavery. But the southern states wanted to secede because Lincoln came to power and he said after his thing, I am not getting rid of slavery in the southern states. He said that clearly after he got elected. And then and the southern states still wanted to secede. And the reason is because it all goes all the way back to 1816 and the Dallas Tariff of 1816, where America had been at war with Britain in the War of 1812. We're not even taught about this War of 8. We went to America.
We burned down the White House, didn't we?
Yeah, for the three-year war. We lost. We always lose when we go to war with America, but we had other wars to fight with Napoleon and so on. Yeah, I'm impressed that you knew about it. But anyway, America was woefully underprepared because it was relying on UK imports from the UK. So they said, we've got to build our own industry so that we don't get caught with our trousers down again. And the southern states said, all fine. And all the tax money came from exporting cotton and tobacco and sugar to the UK. They would buy goods from the UK, industrial goods from the UK and Europe in return. They would come into Virginia, Carolina, all those states there. And then the tariff revenue from those imports would fund the federal government. And at one point, something like 90% of federal government revenue was being paid by the South. And the South would always go, look, we're paying too much here. You only needed it for a little bit. So they'd reduce the tax. And then there'd be another tax come in and all the northern states were going, no, we need the money. And the northern states would be very, they would manipulate the democracy of the thing and they would vote for it. And so they'd impose a greater tariff. And it was an ongoing source of contention for 50 or 60 years. But it was the main reason, if you look at all the literature, it was the main reason all the southern states wanted to secede is we are subsidizing the north and we don't want to anymore. And so we'd rather just have our own little country. And, the concept of the United States of America in 1860 wasn't as established as it is now. And the northern states, and the Lincoln quote, what about the revenue? That's the thing. What about the revenue? He was protecting union revenue. He always talked about protecting the union, but he was protecting the revenue. And so this is just an untold version of the American Civil War story that you never learn. So, but anyway, obviously Lincoln won and history got rewritten by the victors and it was all about slavery and blah, blah, blah. So why did you have segregation then? But anyway, so... Yeah. It was still, and in fact, America got income tax for the very first time during the Civil War imposed by Lincoln, but then it was abandoned shortly after the war. But anyway, this tariff thing was a big ongoing problem coming into the 20th century, and they were constantly trying to get income tax over the line. And the way, bizarrely, they got income tax eventually over the line was, this is the most ridiculous. This just shows you how stupid democracies and lobby groups are. The prohibitionist movement, led by a guy called Walter Wheeler. Walter Wheeler was his name, I think so. He invented pressure politics, and he unified the most, like he'd had the KKK and the Jewish lobby all together on this one anti-alcohol thing. And he was just, you're either with us or against us. And if you're not with us, we're going to smear you. And he would destroy his enemies. He got injured by a drunken farmer when he was a kid, and he had this lifelong loathing of alcohol. But the reason he couldn't get prohibition over the line was because the US was so dependent on alcohol taxes at this point. Particularly from the German brewers and the British brewers in the northern states, and he just couldn't get it over the line, because if he got rid of alcohol taxes, there was just going to be no government revenue. And then suddenly there was this income tax thing, and he became the most ardent supporter of income tax, because he knew once they had income tax, they could get rid of the alcohol taxes. And that's one of the reasons they got prohibition over the line. It was never a majority thing, but like all these things, anyway. So the tax history of tariffs and income tax and what went on, there's a lot that you're never told about. But anyway, so I guess tariffs are kind of working for Trump at the moment. But what I would like to see is, rather than the boasting about, look at this tariff there, is a clear reduction of income tax.
Right.
But it's not in a position when it can do that, the United States, because its deficits are still so enormous.
Yes.
And it is, I mean, I was listening to an earnings call with a company that I'm invested in just yesterday night, and it's building all these solar panel recycling factories in Nevada. And one of the questions that was coming into people is, all the parts for these factories that you're building, are they vulnerable to tariffs? And it's one of the most asked questions now. Are we going to have to pay tariffs? And the guy was going, no, they're all manufactured in Oregon and California, so we're not going to have to pay tariffs. And the investors are like, few. So it's a big issue in the States, as you can imagine. And there's obviously some hate it and some loathe it. But, but Trump is also using tariffs as America uses the US dollar as a carrot and stick. You do what we tell you, we'll give you a good deal. And I think the Swiss prime minister or the Swiss president upset him a couple of weeks ago. Trump managed was a bit ruder off, and he just imposed 36% tariffs on Switzerland. Yeah. And so suddenly Americans can't buy expensive chocolate or expensive Swiss watches anymore. And so we laugh about it, but it's, if you're in the watch business or in the chocolate business or something. But in fact, this affected the gold business, because most gold gets refined through Switzerland, then it goes to America, to the COMEX, to be sold. And then suddenly they're imposing 36% on Swiss gold bars, refined gold bars, and that the whole gold industry was like, oh my God, the gold price is going to have to go up 36% to reflect Trump's new tariffs. If then they realised the sort of heavy-handedness of their tariff, and they made a few exemptions, and that's how they got it over. So like, it's just much more nuanced than tariffs good, tariffs bad, basically.
Your point, though, about income tax, I mean, very interesting that it was the easiest thing for them to tax. But what's so frustrating is that on basic incentive, you're taxing people for their work. I agree. Of all the things that you shouldn't tax, it's income. You should encourage. A nation needs people working, and that is taxed as much as it is, painfully high here in Britain as well. Just for me, it sort of boggles the mind. I don't know how we get out of that death cycle. It's probably impossible.
I couldn't agree more, Winston. Like, not only are you taxing people, like it's immoral. You're taxing people on their productivity, and not only are you taxing them heavily, 40-50%, if you're on a higher rate, the money you're paying them with is you're paying the other tax, which is taxation by inflation, or Milton Friedman calls it taxation without legislation. So let's just say you're the rich guy who's got a house, one generation, and you're the young guy coming through. All you've got as a young guy coming through is your labour. That's all you've got. And every time you work to get to the rich, become the rich guy with the house, constantly 40, 50% shaved off. And then the money you're paying with, you try and save it and it loses its purchasing power. Meanwhile, the guy sits there with the house, and the house, unless he sells the house or trades or anything, he just sits there with the house, it goes untaxed. And so you get this huge gap. So no wonder the left is saying we need wealth taxes. And I can see why they're saying it. I just don't think it's the answer. And wealth taxes are not practical as it happens, which is otherwise more countries would have them. And we pay other kinds of wealth taxes anyway, stamp duty and so on. But that's why that argument comes. And it's just so hard for a young person to close the gap between young and old. And the two big criminals are income tax and money that doesn't keep its value.
So, Dom, The Secret History of Gold, where can people find it?
It's published by Penguin, and you can buy it at Waterstones, Amazon, and all good bookshops. And I would urge you, if you are going to buy a copy, there's so much in the book that we just didn't even go anywhere near. All the stuff about gold and eternity and myths and what an amazing substance gold is. And it's the greatest motivator in human history. People have done more for gold than they have because it's wealth. It's inspired people to do the most amazing, brilliant, and also terrible things in all history. But I want you to all to buy it, but I want you to buy it the week it comes out, because if you buy it the week it comes out, then you increase your chances of getting in the bestseller list.
You've now said something I disagree with, so we have to carry on our conversation. Okay. You said it's the greatest motivator. I don't think it is the greatest motivator.
You're going to say sex or food?
Well, I think sex is probably a greater motivator, but I would say our faith is a better motivator. And, I have to challenge you as... I happen to think if...
The gold and silver are mine, saith the Lord.
The pursuit of wealth is pretty... I don't think there's anything wrong with making money. And I have a sort of John Wesley attitude to my philosophy and my faith, but it can be perilous too. And if gold is your God, then hell awaits you, I think.
Well, you open up a can of worms there, Winston Marshall. You look at, there's so many stories. We'll start perhaps the most famous prospector of all, Jason, as in Jason the Argonauts. And he set out from Iolkos, and he'd heard about this golden fleece, this fleece of gold, which would be in Colchis, which would be where today is Georgia. And he's thought to have been the first Greek to navigate the complex currents of the Bosphorus and go, past where Constantinople, Istanbul is, and into the Black Sea. And he went there to retrieve this golden fleece. Now, as a sidetrack for a moment, myth of this fleece had come west from Colchis, but in those days in Georgia, when they were panning gold, you would take a fleece of a sheep, the skin of a sheep, and you would stretch it across wooden, like a wooden frame, and you'd stick it in the river. And the gold dust and the fragments of gold would get caught in the hairs of the fleece, and then you'd hang the fleece out to dry, and then you'd comb out the gold dust. So that's how they panned gold. And then the myth of this fleece standing by a tree, you can see how the myth, how the story came around. And if you've got a fleece with a load of gold in it, you're going to guard it with dragons and all the other things that fleece was guarded with. Anyway, Jason went off on his mission to retrieve this golden fleece. And he had Hercules with him. He had Castor and Pollux and Orpheus and all these ancient Greek heroes with him. And they had all these adventures, and eventually they got to Colchis, and the daughter of the king, Medea, fell in love with Jason, and he stole off with her. And they stole the gold and came all the way back to Greece. And then Jason fell in love with somebody else, and he killed his stepfather. And Medea then killed her own children that she'd had with Jason. And Jason, who'd been the first and most successful gold prospector in history, just died alone in the rotting. His boat was called the Argo, and he just died alone, lonely and broken in the Argo. And so many characters through history. Pizarro was another one. When he conquered the biggest empire in the world at the time with 50 men and a couple of horses. Just amazing story, amazing bravery. But they all ended up. They found these incredible riches, and they almost without exception, none of them ended up happy. They all ended up
quite
Yeah.
So you're supporting my argument then?
I am.
Okay, yeah.
But in the course
Look,
of, but in the
gold
course
is
of,
a great
but there are some
medium.
people who found great wealth and did great things with it.
Correct. And
But in the doing what they're doing, they opened
But
up
not
new
bec-
frontiers. They invented incredible things. You know, you look at the alchemists on their quest to chemistry was born because of alchemy, and you know they made Isaac Newton was a great alchemist and made incredible discoveries because he was trying to find a way of creating gold out of thin air. So the pursuit of wealth for wealth itself, you have to have a higher goal. I would agree with that, and that's kind of what you're saying.
yeah, that is exactly what I'm saying.
But I mean that's Elon Musk. You know,
Yes.
he does what he thinks is right, and the money takes care of itself. And I think that's the way to live.
Right.
But we all want to be rich. Think of the wonderful things we'll do with our money when we're rich.
Well, I think I want maximum prosperity for maximum humans, and why I found your conversation interesting is because I do think that we're discussing the mediums by which we can achieve that. And so I think gold might be one of them. Obviously, that's the case you make.
It's sound, it's God's money, it's true money, it's honest, it's pure, it's what money should be.
Let's go to the Substack and talk music.
Let's do it.
First question from Mojo. He wants to know your opinion about the WEF Agenda 2030 and their slogan, "You will own nothing and be happy."
There are numerous ways you can interpret that.
What's your take on CBDCs? Let's talk about your music. I found it pretty daring to talk about...
But I don't have a record deal. I lose money on making my song videos. A lot of venues just will not have me. And then the woman who did the posters, and she'd worked in this venue for 25 years, and she just went, if that guy is coming to this venue, I've worked here for 25 years and I'm resigning. I'm trying to get you to come and do a guest spot in one of my gigs.
Would
one
love
time.
to.
But there's definitely room for a banjo player.
Well, you heard it here first. You cover everything that you shouldn't cover.
Yeah, well, I've got about 3 coming up about immigration.
Well, I'm proud of the songs that I did contribute, and
Are you still mates with them?
thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Dominic Frisby. Head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk right now to hear that extended conversation between me and Dominic, where he takes some of your questions and we chat music. But until next time, be well.